guys.
We were there in the early days. My father was a vice president at one time with Dr. Johnson. And of course, Dr. Johnson, everything was in his kitchen at one time. I mean, all of GMHA started in his kitchen in Rutland. I must speak of Mrs. Johnson, who was the right hand. She did everything.
It started out as an 80-mile ride in Rutland for several years, and then they moved it to Woodstock out of the Woodstock Inn stables, and it became a 3-day 100-mile.
The site in Woodstock was so much smaller and so much more compact that we were more like a family out of that site.
It was a wonderful place in Woodstock to be. Everybody knew each other and we helped each other.
It was really pretty exciting riding out early in the morning from the old Woodstock Inn stables and having people lined up on either side of the street cheering for you, and it was usually kind of a little dark and cold.
I could not believe that a whole town could be so horse-oriented, and the whole town was into it.
Back then, the 100-mile ride was maybe the biggest act in town. We didn't have a lot of competition for excitement like that. And most of us weren't into horses, so this was all kind of a new thing. We were told early on, you don't make a lot of noise or sudden movements in front of horses. So in addition to getting us up on time, it also caused us to behave ourselves. So there was a great benefit to becoming a fan of the 100-mile ride, It taught us some courtesies that we wouldn't have normally exhibited.
There was just a lot of camaraderie and bringing people together.
You go in and feed your horse, and then we all walked over to the white cupboard where the breakfast was, and it was candle lit. I mean, it was like another world, and for a horse-crazy kid, I was just in heaven.
It just was the biggest thing in the year, bigger than Christmas.
I remember one year, about 3 or 4 of us, maybe Nancy Case, and we were juniors, and we went around and we looked at all the horses, and we were going to decide who's going to win. And I can't remember who we came up with was going to win, but we looked at Sherman Haight's beautiful big gray hunter and said, "Oh, he is way too big. He might not even finish." And it won the whole thing. But
well, it was another century when we first came just to observe, and the end of the ride was out here at the Upway Oval, and my father and I came to watch it, and that just immediately got into our blood. We started coming in 1940, and just went on from there.
When I was a child, what people did with horses was they trail rode them, and they went to horse shows, and it used to be a family event. They would take their children and they'd go trail riding, and they would be small riding clubs, and there would be other families involved. And I think that's a lot of the tradition of the 100-mile. The entire family would come and watch another member of the family participate, and they would have picnic lunches, and it was the conclusion of the summer season.
I rode my first ride out of the inn stables in 1960, and it was such a privilege to be riding the 100 with people who've ridden it for years before me.
One year, the Vermont Firefighters or Fire Chiefs Association was meeting at the Woodstock Inn, the old Woodstock Inn. And they were halfway into their meal and fairly well into other things that they were consuming, and all of a sudden, one of the fellows jumped up and looked out the window. He said, "My golly, we've got a fire!" And that was when Ferguson Stables was burning down. So here are all these firemen from all over Vermont witnessing one of the most spectacular fires in the history of Woodstock.
When it moved out to South Woodstock, they did have a lot of people still watching it. But today's ride, there's very few people that stand around and watch it.
The quality of shoeing, the people taking care of their horses has improved drastically to my mind, since 1988.
a huge difference is these horses got no electrolytes, and watering was very careful. On the trail, you never let your horse drink all it wanted. And things have changed so much for the better.
Back in 1965, I rode the ride, and I have looked at the score sheets today, and I've looked back at my old score sheets, and they're very, very simple. On the left-hand side, it tells about any of the blemishes or things that you wanted to declare on your horse, and then on the right-hand side was the evaluation by the vets.
The judges were very, there was always a colonel or a major and a veterinarian. And I just remember you didn't really talk to them much. I mean, I was very shy anyway. And they were very kind, very nice, but they shared nothing. And your horse was measured and weighed, and I mean, they did they did it like an old army thing.
The score sheets years ago allowed for a lot of personal judgment, whereas today it's a matter of fact. There isn't the opportunity for a judge or a person to put their personal likes or dislikes into the scoring.
In the winter was the horse that they felt could go on and do another 100 miles and do it just fine. And that's how they judged it, which I really don't have a whole lot of argument with that either.
The GMHA office always picks capable judges, usually judges that have participated in the sport before, so they can understand what we're going through on this trail. But and there's so many variables with this ride, because it can be 90 degrees, and some years it's 50 and 60 degrees, or even a frost we've had. And so it's fun to see how people manage their horses. But the judging is always first class here.
I always said that I was going to do the 100-mile because my husband, Gardner, had done it when he was 16 and used to brag about doing it. So I figured I had to do it.
A friend of mine and I went to a little local horse show. I had no trailer or anything, and we rode them 8 miles to the horse show, and I hated it. The horses jumped around. I never even got in a class because one horse was in and one horse was out, and they were being stupid. So we rode them home, and I thought, oh, I just did 16 miles. And a friend of mine said, there's this thing called competitive trail riding. Maybe we should do that.
I was getting really disillusioned with the show ring, dressage and jumping and standing around for 5 hours to show for 2 minutes. And when I did my first ride, I was hooked.
This was, I think, one of the first places I may have come to was here. And from my first ride on, I just fell in love with the whole thing.
Well, I've been riding the competitive trail rides for a while and enjoying at least finishing successfully, even if not first. And when you try it, you just want to go that one step further. And when you're doing it, the 100-mile is that last step.
One day I was with my dad and my mother, and I was in the back seat. My dad said, "Well, kid, I want you to get your horse ready and ride on the 100-mile trail ride." And I said, "What? What? Okay." So I did. And I rode all by myself. I keep thinking I might have been 12, but I think I was younger. I bet I was more like 9. And I would get about a mile from home and get scared and come home.
Coming over today, I recognize all those hills, and they haven't changed.
Harlotry Exuberance came out of Pennsylvania and did not know what a Vermont hill was. Started conditioning her, and she said, "No, I'm not going up that hill. That hill is just out of my range."
I was riding Omar, Paul Kendall's horse, and Omar had a fantastic walk. And when you have a horse that has a good walk, when you get into difficult terrain, you just let the horse walk right through it.
The condition of the roads have changed. They have gotten much harder because the town is now putting more gravel in each spring during the mud season, and this packs and makes them very hard. And then in the summertime, they use calcium chloride to keep the dust down. And so the horse gets this up in his skin, in his elbow area, and it creates sores, swelling, and it's very hard to keep that washed out.
At the beginning of the season, I lay out my whole season's ride and shoeing with the idea that he'll hit his peak of fitness right at the time of the ride. So I start out with some 25s and I do some 50s. We do some horse camping. I do a tremendous amount of hill work because I live in what's relatively flat land compared to Vermont. And I work the whole season, and that's my final goal of the year.
In order to condition your horse, you have to do a lot of miles and ride a lot of miles. You have to ride a lot of slow miles and control. And then you can build it from there.
It takes a minimum of 3 months to get ready for this ride, and that's riding, you know, living here. We're so lucky to live here in these hills and these roads, and that would be riding like 6 miles a day, 5 days a week.
Vermont hillsides are testing. Vermont courses are testing from Reading to Pomfret.
I don't know how many towns you go through during the 100-mile ride, but it must be half a dozen. And you see some of the most beautiful scenery in Vermont.
On good days, you see a lot more of the beauty than on bad days. I had some particularly tough horses that I rode, and sometimes the challenge of keeping them in hand prohibited me from seeing the beauty around me.
On my first GMHA 3-day 100, on the very first day, I was riding along with a friend of mine, Dorothea Meldrum, and someone was off their horse in front of us, slapping its butt and saying, "Look out, there's bees." So Dorothea and I carefully tried to find our way around the section of trail that had the bee's nest in it, but we were unable to go around. There was barbed wire on one side and a cliff on the other side. So she said, "Well, we'll just have to run for it. I'll go first." So she did, and she made it. I think she got stung once. But by the time I went to run through it, the bees were all angry and they swarmed my horse, and he just was bucking wildly in place, not smart enough to go forward. I stayed on for a while, but eventually I hit the ground, and then the bees swarmed me. My horse took off one way and I ran the other, and Dinah Rojek helped me brush the bees off my face and off my body, and then my horse came back, and I got back on and rode through them again. Someone went to town and got some Benadryl for me, and I managed to finish that ride, and so did my horse.
Yeah, we get bees when we're riding sometimes, but the good thing is don't be behind, don't be the last one. Because the first one is okay, but the last one is get all the bees. So.
I was out about 3 miles and my saddle turned. And Lucille Kenyon was on the ride that year. And lucky me, she stopped. She helped me get my saddle all squared away and made sure that I was back on my mount and off and running. And I appreciated it because I knew that she was a real competitor. But it just shows the sportsmanship that is shared by all of the riders.
The major variable is the weather. No matter, it can change so much so fast.
If it's raining, we go out. If it's cold, we go. If it's snowing, we go. So we do. It doesn't matter what is the weather. When you're competing, you cannot say, "No, I'm not going because it's cold." Well, you can, but you don't do it.
If I started out with a brand new horse to get ready for the 3-day 100, I would plan on doing the 3-day 100 in a few years. I wouldn't do it this year. I would ride the horse. I would probably start out walking a lot, getting the horse used to hills, making sure the horse knows how to behave, work on ground manners, work on the trail manners, make sure that the horse isn't afraid of cars, all that sort of stuff.
I try and ride 3 or 4 times a week when there's no snow on the ground. It's not always possible, of course, just given that life has to happen outside of riding, which is too bad sometimes.
I see that people that are most interested take the best care. And I think those who do the training themselves take the best care. A lot of people don't have time and they leave the training to somebody else, and they just don't realize the care involved.
It's Denny Emerson who always says you could have a lesser horse with a good rider rather than a fantastic horse with a lesser rider. I think that a mediocre horse with a clever horseman is probably a better situation.
I would like to see more juniors participating because I think that's where you get the growth in the future for the ride But with the school calendars the way they are now, it kind of cuts away the opportunities for juniors.
I'm not sure whether it has to do more with the generation of today's world, that there's so many disciplines, riding disciplines out there, that you're not going to see people really interested in competitive trail riding, except ones that are actually doing it.
I've been doing it for 18 years now, and I'm the young pup on the crew. And you see some people come along and say, I would like to enjoy this sport, then you don't see them again.
We're lucky that GMHA 100 still has a lot of entries, but when I first started, I think there was a waiting list, and there's not a waiting list now.
When we rode, there were articles in the paper all the time, all the papers, not just one paper.
There were more people then. I remember there were just all sorts of people on the grounds cheering you on when you left and being out on the trail. And I was over here several years ago and I didn't notice that amount of people around. There just wasn't the interest. I think there were more other things going on.
When I first moved to South Woodstock, I lived at Fran Gillep's house on Fletcher Hill, and her husband Boots had been the general manager or executive director of GMHA, and their son Ham, who had ridden in the 100 Mile as a child, told me a story, and he actually wrote a poem about this, going out with his father in the GMHA Jeep and marking the 100 Mile trail by headlight. And his father would drive, and he would put up the arrows in the tin can cars. So that story's always been very endearing to me because it was a great, father and son special time together.
I heard this from the mouth of the man that it happened to, Roy Hall, who rode a horse named Burning Sand. And he came in and finished the ride, dismounted, and fell down. And his horse kicked him and broke his leg, and he won the ride.
On my right is Roy Hall, and he is riding Burning Sand, who was a winner, I think, more than once. This is the end of my first 100 Mile. I was winning the horsemanship trophy and thrilled to death. This is the same mare as the picture before with my second 100 Mile, and I think you can tell by the expression that I was properly astounded.
I did win a couple of trophies with Springlet. This is Carlene Johnson. She was Miss USA in 1955-56, and she presented me with a trophy. It could have been a horsemanship award. I'm really not sure what it was.
One of my first mules did do the 3-day 100 up here, and it was at the time when helmets were not a requirement, and I'm very glad now that helmets are a requirement.
As far as riders went, the one that I was in awe of course, was Mrs. Harper, who came with her van and her groom and those gorgeous horses.
She made quite an impression on me as a young teenager. She rode a side saddle.
Her side saddle was specially made on the offside because she had been hurt several times hunting. She hunted all over the world.
She was very stately and just was very accomplished in what she did side saddle, and that's pretty remarkable to ride a whole 100 miles. And she was not a young woman at the time. I don't remember how old she was, but at 12 years old, she seemed ancient to me.
I'd have to agree with Susie about Mrs. Harper. I rode with her probably 2 minutes and she was gone.
In those days, the trails were not they weren't very park-like. And somebody had dropped a tree, or they were logging across one of the trails. And it was pretty big and pretty high. And we're all standing there milling around, and along came Mrs. Harper, and over she went, and away she went around the corner. Well, we all climbed down through the bushes and down the bank and up the other side.
She rode side saddle. I'd never seen anybody ride side saddle. And this was a novelty. And everybody would applaud when this wonderful older lady would come by with this long skirt and the gloves, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful scene.
This silver platter is the Grand Champion Perpetual Trophy for the GMHA 3-day 100-mile ride. It has names on it that go back to 1949, and the first person's name on it is Mrs. Fletcher Harper, and she was riding side saddle.
sticks out in your mind?
There's one, but it probably don't need to be on the tape.
Oh, what's that? Tell us.
First day I saw her. Because I said to the guy, who the hell's that? He said, that's Jenny Kimberly, and she's married. And I said, shit. And it took me 15 years to get here.
I can remember riding with Reba Reed once, and Reba liked to talk to her horse. And she had a name for almost every hazard on the trail. And I particularly remember her referring to a metal culvert as an alligator. And we'd go along and she'd see the end of a metal culvert sticking out, and she'd tell her horse to watch out for the alligator. There was an alligator coming. Took me quite a while to figure out what she was talking about.
The owner always kept the trophies. And when Mrs. Kelly, my friend Mrs. Kelly, heard that, she said, "What did you say?" And I said, "Well, Joan always kept the trophies." So without me knowing it, 2 or 3 months later, she presented me with a beautiful belt buckle with a gold crown with 2 rubies set into the crown. It's inscribed Best Trail Horse, 1957, Green Mountain Horse Association. And I just treasure that.
I can remember I wanted to get my son to come over to watch me ride, and he is not into horses at all. He thinks they smell. We went through the whole vetting, and he's waiting around just like this, long waiting, and saying, "Oh, Ma, when is this over?" So then there was, the white ring, what the big procedure with the white ring, and wait around, more waiting around. They went through all of the ribbons, and my name wasn't mentioned. And he says, "Oh, gee, my mom's going to be so disappointed." Right. They're not calling her name, and all the horses seem to have the name, and then they saved it for last because we got to name champions. So it's pretty exciting, but I'm just all broken up.
Oh, knew Ken Miner, one-shot Miner. Ken worked for us, and he would go to a football game or Green Mountain, or he'd go to some other event, and he'd take one shot. He'd take one shot, and you just hoped it came out okay. And it usually did.
never ceases to amaze me at the end of the first day and at the end of the second day, how the horses recover so quickly. We come back the next morning and they're all pumped up, ready to go.
It's a chance to relate with your friends and to enjoy the best part of it, which is your horse and your friends.
There's something about the GMHA 3-day 100 that makes you get so excited and happy to do it. The trails are just absolutely beautiful. The people are wonderful. The sort of pomp and circumstance of it all is exciting.
The GMHA 100 is the pinnacle in our sport, as far as I'm concerned. It's the hardest, the oldest, the most historic, probably the best run, the most beautiful trails, and it's a challenge. In the sport, this is as good as it gets.
It's like being in a fantasy world. It's enchanting. It's so quiet. It's the beginning of the day. The mist is rising off from the ground because the days are so warm and the nights are cold. And as you're riding through the mist, the sun is breaking through and everything is sparkly. It's quiet. The birds start to sing, and all you hear is the sound of your horse's hooves, on the grass and then on the dirt roads, and then the sound changes when you get on a nice soft trail.
I think the 100-mile ride defined GMHA. This was a major event. I think it's the oldest in the United States of its kind. People came from literally all over the United States to participate and to watch.
I think probably the 100-mile gave me my best education about caring for a horse.
Many horses start, but not many finish. So any ride for us finishes a big compliment.
You know, there's no other feeling like riding 100 miles and finishing 100 miles.
I'll never forget, there was about a mile to go on the third day, and it hit me. It's like, we did it. We made it. It was so exciting.
Even after doing lots of hundreds, just that feeling at the end of the ride that a horse can really do this. I mean, it's remarkable, just to put your hand on their neck and say, it's amazing that they can climb these mountains and just do it with ease. They're so lucky that they don't worry about yesterday and they don't think about tomorrow. They live for today and they just do it. And maybe that's what people ought to be like too. Maybe life would be easier.
I've done other competitive rides, but there's just something special about the 100 mile.
Vermont PBS, partnering with local filmmakers to bring you stories made here. For more, visit vermontpbs.org.